Thank you everyone for coming. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. Professor Rosalyn LaPier is an enrolled member of the Blackfeet tribe of Montana and also has Metis heritage from Red River, Manitoba and the Turtle Mountain community. She's Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Montana and has previously held positions at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, the Harvard Divinity School, and last year spent a really rough year at the East-West Center in Hawaii, which I'm sure was a trial. She has a diverse background academically. She holds a bachelor's in physics from Colorado College, a master's in liberal studies with a religious studies emphasis from DePaul University, and a PhD in history from the University of Montana. So you can see she's an interdisciplinary scholar. She combines history with religion, environmental science, ethnobotany, and maybe more, we'll find out. And she also had a string of, before these academic appointments, she worked a number of jobs applying her environmental science expertise in the real world, and especially in relation to Native nations and communities. She's the author of a number of books and articles, her most recent monograph, which she's going to be talking about today, and I believe reading from a little bit today, Invisible Reality, Storytellers, Story Takers, and the Supernatural World of the Blackfeet, was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2017. It won 2 major awards from the Western History Association, the 2018 John C. Ewers Award for the best book on the topic of North American Indian ethnohistory, and the 2018 Don Fixico Award, which recognizes innovative work in the fields of American Indian and Canadian First Nations history. It was also a finalist for the 2018 High Plains Book Award. Last year, I was serving on a different book award committee for the Western History Association, and her press accidentally sent me a copy, sending it to the wrong committee. So I let them know that it was not the right committee, but they said I could keep the book, and I'm glad that I did. So join me in welcoming Professor LaPier.
So good morning, thank you. I'm gonna first ask the video person if I am sounding okay. Okay, good. When you get tape recorded, you have to be really careful. They give you mics, and you always end up touching them at some point. You're not supposed to touch these things. You hold like this. And you're not supposed to move out of the light either. So you can't walk across stage. Anyway. So thank you very much, everyone, to coming today to hear me talk. I am going to speak a little bit about the book that I published 2 years ago, and it just came out in paperback, and share about my kind of journey to write that particular book and some of the questions I asked and attempted to answer. But I'm going to start first by introducing myself and letting you know who my family is. So in sort of Blackfeet culture, one of the things that you do in terms of introducing yourself to people that you don't know is you introduce your 4 grandparents. So it's considered in our society sort of like improper protocol to actually say who you are, because that's sort of rising your status up that you shouldn't be doing. And so you're supposed to introduce who your 4 grandparents are, and by letting people know who your 4 grandparents are, then people will make connections with you. Are you a relative of this person? Are you not a relative of this person? Are you related to the band or clan that they come from? So making those kind of sort of kinship connections is something that people do by introducing themselves. So on the Blackfeet side of my family, my grandfather's name was Ayukama. He was one of the last generation of people that had singular names. He was given a surname eventually, and so he was known throughout his entire life as Ayukama. But his then given name became Thomas Francis. And Thomas Francis, for those of you who are Irish, will remember Thomas Francis Meagher, who's a really well-known Irish rebel who came here to the United States. So lots of people in the United States, if you're a young man, get named Thomas Francis, after Thomas Francis Meagher. My grandmother's name was Annie Madplume. And one of the things I list up here as well is sort of the bands that they came from and where they lived. So one of the things also in terms of introducing your four grandparents, you also introduce where they came from, because not only is kin connected to actual blood relatives, but kin is also connected to the actual physical environment that you come from. So people will know what creek you came from or what river you're from. And then on the Metis side of my family, my grandfather was Arthur LaPier or LaPier. He was a very well-known fiddle player, and so most people who know that my last name's LaPier, the first thing they'll ask me is, "Are you related to Art LaPier?" And I always say yes, because he was so well known in Métis communities for his artwork. And then my grandmother was Louise Laframboise. The Laframboise family, the LaPier family, are both very huge Métis families across Montana, Manitoba, North Dakota, and so I'm related to lots and lots and lots of folks. Okay. So by way of introduction, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the writing that I do, and to encourage, especially students who don't like to write, because I never used to like to write. As was mentioned, my undergraduate degree is in physics. I love science. I love math. I started as a math major, completely bombed out. So for those of you who've ever taken high-level math will understand this. I started taking abstract algebra. I was like, what the heck are they talking about? And I went to the physics department and I was like, is there anything going to be harder here than like differential equations? And they're like, no. I'm here. So I went over to the physics department, and one of the reasons I did that, one, I love science, but two, as an undergraduate, I was trying to avoid any class where I had to write a paper. If you're in science and math, guess what you don't have to do? You don't write papers. So that's how I ended up sort of a physics major. But after I graduated, I started working with a lot of, as was mentioned, nonprofit NGOs in tribal communities. And one of the things I started doing, because I had a degree, was people would say, hey, can you write us a report? Can you write us a grant? That's how I learned how to write. So if you are given an opportunity to write a report, and the first thing you say is, nope, I don't want to write that report, do it, because it is great training to learn how to be a really good writer. Okay, the first book that I wrote was one on Native American activism. I am really interested in why people do what they do, and that's partly what I'm going to talk about today, right? What makes people act? What makes people not act? And so I was really interested in urban Indians at this time period in my life. I was really interested in why urban Indians became activists. And so I wrote a book called City Indian, let's see, what is the subtitle? Native American Activism in Chicago. The second book I wrote, which is the one I'm going to be talking about today, I was still interested in this idea of action, which I'll go into a little bit more in just a sec. I've written tons of commentaries about all kinds of stuff. My most recent commentary I wrote with High Country News about Mauna Kea and about public lands, and how we are now in a situation in America where the vast majority of Native American sacred sites are now on public lands. Bears Ears is an example, but so is Mauna Kea, and how we are now in a situation where to address both of those issues, sort of public lands and sacred sites, that people need to sort of get together to address those things simultaneously. I'm working on a third book right now, which I'm hoping to complete in the next year, which is on the concept of purity and purification, which is a religious concept. And it's something I've worked on for a couple of years now. Again, thinking about why people sort of do what they do. And one of the avenues in terms of religious practice that people do what they do is they have to be pure. And they have to purify themselves. So what does that mean? And what does that mean to different tribal groups? So, but today we're going to talk about the Blackfeet and the Blackfeet notion of their invisible reality. So I'm showing you a factually incorrect map. So for those of you who know about maps, this is one of those maps where we make the United States look really, really big, and we make Mexico look really, really small. Canada looks really, really small, when in fact they're bigger. Anyway, but this is a pretty map, which is why I'm showing it to you. So on this map, I'm circling the area where that is historic Blackfeet Territory. And historic Blackfeet Territory is really kind of smack dab in the middle of North America, and along the Rocky Mountain front of both Canada and what is now the United States. This is a map of the Northern Great Plains. So outlined in red is the Northern Great Plains, which is a large what is called an ecoregion. And basically the Northern Great Plains is the watershed, for the most part, of the Missouri River. So you can see that big river right through the middle. That is the Missouri River. And so all the water kind of flowing into the Missouri River makes up this large ecoregion. And then the circle that's on there is historic Blackfeet Territory. So Blackfeet Territory makes up what is now kind of most of Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. This is what historic Blackfeet Territory looks like. Right now, there are three reserves, one reservation where the Blackfeet live, 3 reserves in Canada, 1 reservation in Montana, the United States, and they are up against the Rocky Mountains because if you remember the circle, the Blackfeet sort of got pushed all the way to the mountains. So all of the reserves that exist now are right up against the mountains. And so when a lot of people think of Blackfeet Territory and Blackfeet people, they think of us as people of the mountains. And we're not. We're people from the prairies. And one of our original names for ourselves was the Sokiotapi. The Sokiotapi means prairie people. So this is what Montana looks like. It doesn't look like Glacier National Park. That's a very small part of it. Okay. So when people start doing research or writing a book or a paper, an article, they usually start with questions that they want to answer. And one of the questions that I wanted to think about and answer, and I wanted to push back against, was that in environmental history and environmental studies, we often fall back on this trope that Native people lived in harmony and balance with nature. And I wanted to have us think about that. I wanted me to think about that. Do Native people really live in harmony and balance with nature? What does kind of evidence really show us about that? And one of the things that when you study history, and especially if you study environmental history, we have a tendency to fall back on a couple of answers to that question, right? One is that people were influenced by the economics of the community that they were from, right? And especially Indigenous people, we kind of fall back on this, oh, they were just always worried about survival. They worried about how they were going to eat their next meal. They were worried about how they were going to hunt bison. So it falls back on this sort of economic story. The other thing that we often fall back on is thinking about the politics of a community, right? So, you know, that they had a specific political structure to that community, or they had a specific leadership in that community that then they followed. So one of the questions that I wanted to answer in terms of, did people live in harmony and balance with nature? What was their relationship to the natural world? Was to kind of push back against that the answer was found in economics or that the answer was found in politics. And I wanted me first to think about, was there another reason why people were acting the way they were, that they were making decisions in their community the way they were, and what was that answer? And to me, I found that answer in religion and religious practice. And one of the things I argue in this particular book, and that I'm arguing in my next project as well, is that Native people really did think about their religion on a daily basis. They practiced religion on a daily basis, and they made decisions in their daily lives because of their religion. And so they were not making decisions on a daily basis often with economics and politics in mind. And I think that this is true with a lot of communities around the world, but we often, because economics and politics are easier for us to do research on and write about and talk about, that those are the things that we often talk about in our history classes and when we talk about just societies. So, and I think that one of the things that we are still kind of beginning to do in both the academic world, but then also kind of out there in the real world, is talk about the importance of religion in people's lives and the importance of religion in people making the decisions they make about the world that they live in. So I'm going to read a few sections of the book that I wrote and talk about some of those questions that I was asking myself. Okay. So here's photographs of me and my grandmother. This was the one up here in the corner. I think, it looks practically like the 70s. I don't think that's the 70s with the big glasses. Do people wear those anymore? And then more recent, this was actually about 10. I look much older, but that was about 10 years ago, right before my grandmother passed. And then the lower picture is my grandmother with her grandmother. My grandmother was actually raised by her grandmother and her great-grandmother because her mother and her brother passed when she was about a year and a half old in childbirth. So she was raised by two old women. Okay. So my grandmother loved to sit and visit with people. One day when I was an adult, my grandmother told me a story about Spotted Bear, her maternal great-grandfather. It was a story that I had heard many, many, many times before. I stress this point to show you that I can be a slow learner. Spotted Bear was a great warrior, one of the greatest, she would always emphasize. Her favorite stories about Spotted Bear were of his adventures raiding the Crow. That's another tribe. He always seemed to get into a predicament, and of course, he was always able to get out of it. In this particular story about Spotted Bear versus the Crow, my grandmother mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Spotted Bear used his personal medicine power and changed the direction of the wind. Whoa, wait 1 minute, I thought. He changed the direction of the wind? How did he do that? At that moment, I realized that my grandmother and Spotted Bear's relationship to the natural world and their concept of reality was dramatically different from the one that the recorders of Blackfeet Life often wrote about. So one of the things I write about in this particular book is me reading other things that have been written about the tribe, and how one of the things that I thought was missing from a lot of these writings was the religious point of view of the Blackfeet. That one of the things that often got stripped away, again, was when they were telling stories, it was a story of, again, the economics, the politics. It was about how things had been changing on the Blackfeet community, but not often about religion or religious practice. So all of my life, I had heard different kinds of stories from my grandparents of how the Blackfeet altered nature, from stopping the wind from blowing, to controlling animal behavior, to creating snowstorms so powerful it could freeze a person in mid-step. Historians like John Ewers often told of how the natural world shaped Blackfeet behavior, suggesting that the migration of the bison led the Blackfeet to follow the herds. However, my grandparents told stories of how the Blackfeet shaped the natural world. They made the bison come to them. As I thought about my grandparents' stories, I began to recognize common threads that I had not truly noticed before, that the Blackfeet believed that they could change and control the natural world. And this belief gave them a certain level of confidence and authority. For some time, I had thought about the differences between oral history within a community and written history about a community. But it was not until I began formally learning about Blackfeet plant knowledge and ethnobotany from my grandmother and my aunt that I began to seriously understand these differences. This book reflects both a part of my own journey about learning that knowledge and the stories of my family, and my effort to interpret what other scholars and historians have recorded about the Blackfeet. I wanted to address the dichotomy between internal knowledge versus external scholarship. Did Spotted Bear really think that he, this is a quote I had previously, wrested a living from nature? Probably not. He had the power to change the direction of the wind. So one of the things I became really interested in was just researching that and thinking about, if there is a community of people who thinks that they're making their decisions based on their ability to change the natural world, right? If you believe that you can change the wind, the direction of the wind, if you believe that you can change the snow from starting or stopping, if you believe that you can change animal behavior, right, then you are not reacting to the natural world, you're in control of the natural world. And that's a completely different kind of mindset and worldview that people have. So that means that when they are making just daily decisions, again, if you're thinking about the old system that scholars think about, the economics, the politics, does that even matter anymore, right? Are they thinking about economics when they can change the direction of the wind, right? Are they thinking about political leadership, when they can stop a snowstorm from happening? Probably not. So it made me really rethink the way I was thinking about the history of Indigenous people, and made me rethink about how, not only with the Blackfeet tribe, but with other Indigenous people as well, how are they thinking their relationship to the natural world, but also just the relationship to the world, is impacted by their religious belief system. So let's see. So my grandmother told me many stories of her own life and the adventures of her two grandmothers and their husbands. It was rare when she told a story of sorrow or suffering. Many stories of daily life, of moving from place to place, hunting, berry picking, looking for medicine, and cooking and eating. She told a lot of stories about cooking and eating. Oh, happy times, she would say. But interwoven within these stories of daily life were different stories about people, animals, and beings that the Blackfeet shared space with and often encountered. For example, when she talked about berry picking along the Badger 2 Medicine, that's along the Rocky Mountain front, she would often talk about the supernatural horses that lived in the small mountain lakes. These horses lived underwater, and they swam from lake to lake. They swam under the ground from lake to lake. Some of these horses, she said, swam from the small mountain lakes on the east side of the mountains, underwater and under the mountains, into the west side of the lakes, over to Flathead Lake, which is a really large lake. The vast majority of these stories collected by the early recorders of Blackfeet life were what my grandmother called real stories, or stories told of the relationship between the Blackfeet and the supernatural. So in his attempts to understand the Blackfeet in the late 19th century, Father Emile Legal reflected that it was, quote, the natural instinct in all of us to believe in the existence of invisible realities, unquote. He recognized that at the essence of Blackfeet life was the belief that, quote, the visible was only a manifestation of the invisible, unquote. From their earliest recordings, the Blackfeet told others about their unique view of the history of their people. they emphasized that the Blackfeet believed that the invisible dimension was the real world, and that the visible dimension was a partial expression of this reality. So one of the things that I did when I went and looked back at some of the stories that had been told around 100 years ago, ones that were recorded and were published, but also ones that were recorded and are in the archives or special collections, like we have right out the door here, were that I assumed, and so do lots of other people, when you're looking at that time period, right, the turn of the last century, that the stories that people are going to leave behind are going to be stories of sorrow, of struggle, of the diseases that are happening. I mean, and it was not a good time period. It really wasn't. So there was disease, right? There was people dying of starvation, which is a really horrible way to die. There were these things happening in their daily lives. But when they were asked to tell their story and to tell their history, those were not the stories they were telling, right? They were telling the stories that were important. I'm gonna hit this again. They were telling stories that were important to them. And that was their relationship with the supernatural realm, their relationship with animals, with plants, with supernatural beings, right? That's what gets left behind. So like I said, I was surprised when I started looking into this and saying, oh, I'm going to find this story of sorrow and hardship. That is not what I found. So one of the things I wanted to do as kind of a recorder of this story is tell the story from their point of view. And if telling the story from their point of view, that means telling a story that talks about their relationship with the supernatural realm, but also their kind of daily religion and religious practice. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so one of the things that happened at the turn of the last century, and one of the things I do in this particular book is I start with the year 1910. And the reason I decided to start with the year 1910 was I wanted to start with the year before my grandparents were born. So my grandparents were born in 1911 and 1914. And so I wanted to know, what was the world like? What was the reservation like in 1910, right before they were born? And what was the reservation like and the community like for their parents right before they were born? And so I kind of look at that time period. That's kind of my starting time period is 1910, to look at the community, what's happening, who's there, who's coming and going, what the economics are like. And so one of the things that's happening in 1910 is there's a lot of outsiders that are coming in to record stories. So at that time period, there's still, and I'm sure you've learned this in some of your classes, there was still this time period around the turn of the last century where there was a belief that native people would be gone, right? This was the time when, the bison were gone. Lots of different animal and plant species were being decimated. So there was also a belief that indigenous people would no longer live into the 20th century. And so there was a time when museums and academic institutions kind of rushed out to tribal communities to record kind of the last native people before they died. And so even on the Blackfeet reservation, we had dozens of people that came out pretty much from like the 1880s when the bison were decimated to the 1920s, no joke, with like tape recorder in hand to talk to the last native people. And again, I'm assuming, reading this stuff, thinking about it, oh, they're going to tell these stories of sorrow, and they don't. But then one of the things that happens in terms of people coming out and tape recording people was that an economy grew out of that. So I'm going to just read a little bit about that before I move on. Okay, so in 1910, oh, oops, I think I want to go to the next slide. So in 1910, an unintended economy had emerged after the Blackfeet settled onto the reservation. The Blackfeet recognized that they could benefit from the plethora of outsiders visiting the reservation each summer. Dozens of individual Blackfeet, such as Holds Together Woman, who is a relative I'd spoken about in the book previously, began telling their stories, reciting their histories, singing their songs, posing for photographers, having their portraits painted, and making material objects for outsiders, all in exchange for cash, a rare commodity on the reservation. Some of the artisanry that had gone unused for many years was useful again. While the US government had spent the previous 25 years punishing people for practicing their old ways, by 1910, the Great Northern Railroad was paying individual Blackfeet to wear their regalia to lure tourists to the newly created Glacier National Park. And the famous photographer, Edward S. Curtis, was paying Blackfeet to pose for him. So telling or selling stories, though, was not a one-sided transaction, with outsiders asking questions and the Blackfeet blindly answering. Whether it was a story or a song or an object, the Blackfeet learned they could and would get paid for it. A newspaper article about Edward S. Curtis's photography work among the Blackfeet at the turn of the century stated, "There isn't any mystery about the methods of Mr. Curtis. The average Indian will neither be cajoled nor bullied into posing. Mr. Curtis does very little urging. His rule is an old one. Money talks." By 1910, even as the federal government increasingly restricted the Blackfeet reservation economic system, the Blackfeet did not lose control over their ability to tell or sell their own stories. So one of the things I also talk about in here is that we often, when we think about the past and when we think about this time period, again, it was a time period where there was a lot of depredations. It was a time period of suffering. It was also still a time period where people had agency. They decided what they wanted to do. They decided who they wanted to talk to. They decided what they were going to sell. It was not, and one of the things I decided to do when I looked in the archives and I looked for examples and evidence is I tried to find examples of where people were negotiating over prices, right? So for example, I have an example of the American Museum of Natural History, which is where Clark Whistler was. He bought a lot of items from the Blackfeet. He went and purchased actually a lot of stories from the Blackfeet. And there's an example where he went and asked to buy an object from an older woman who was a widow, and she named her price. And he was like, no, I'm not going to pay that price. They went back and forth in writing, correspondence, for 2 years. She got the price she wanted. So there's numerous examples like that of people deciding what they wanted to sell, deciding what they wanted to tell, and being the ones that were in the position to make those negotiations. I think that one of the things we often think about, for those of us who do like Indigenous history, is we look at those time periods in the past and we think that a lot of Indigenous people were sort of victims to museums or victims to scholars who are coming out and studying them. And we really have to think about that differently, because I think one of the things that evidence shows us is that's not always the case. Okay, having just said that, sometimes they were the victims. I mean, there are actual examples of that as well, where individual museums will come out and they will try to knowingly cheat people out of, or steal. There's examples of people like going into people's houses and stealing stuff. So that happened as well. But when we're thinking about this time period, we have to also realize that people had agency as well. And they would decide whether or not they wanted their photograph taken. They would decide whether or not they wanted to sell something or tell something. Okay. So let me tell a little bit about some of the stuff that they were recording. So the early recorders of Blackfeet Life interviewed dozens of people at the turn of the 20th century in an attempt to understand Blackfeet lives and lifeways. All of these individuals told similar stories. The Blackfeet had a distinct view of the universe that included having a well-established relationship with the supernatural realm. They created alliances with the supernatural and accessed supernatural power for a variety of purposes. The supernatural provided a place for friendship, kinship, and even sanctuary. The Blackfeet told the recorders of Blackfeet Life that the invisible realm was not only real to them, but omnipresent. It structured not only their views of the universe, but much of their social behavior as well. It permeated their daily lives, and they created mnemonic devices to remember and share their stories about it. David Duval and Clark Whistler noted that, quote, mythical characters are regarded as having at least important contributions to the welfare of the people, unquote. So the visible symbolic representations served as reminders to the Blackfeet of the role of their own history, stories, family, and community, and of the humble place of humans in this larger, invisible realm. But it also represented who they could contact when they needed assistance to alter the natural world. For the Blackfeet, the unseen was just as real, or even at times more real, than what they saw in their everyday lives. Father Legal recognized this from his first interactions with the Blackfeet. He observed that the Blackfeet believed in an invisible dimension that took on a completely, this is his quote, it took on a completely distinct reality, and it defined their existence. So this is a photo, I'm going to end there. This is a photo of my grandfather's parents, and they also did not have first name, last name until way later in lives, and also a picture of their teepee. And that's what's on the cover of the book. And one of the things I write about in the book is how teepees are a mnemonic device. How if you memorize what is on a teepee, and people did, it served as a mnemonic device to understand the supernatural realm and to understand the very different parts of the universe. And people did. So there were a lot of, one of the things I talk about, there's a lot of mnemonic devices that people had to understand their role as humans in the universe, but then the role of everybody else sort of in the universe. And teepees was one of those places where people could look at not just this teepee, but kind of any teepee, and they could read it, right? They could read the stories that were on there, and they could retell those stories to other people. So people's physical daily life was part of their own sacred text. So one of the things I write about is that although Indigenous people, a lot of Indigenous people did not have written sacred texts, their daily life was a sacred text, and so was their landscape was a sacred text, because every place had a story, and all of those stories told them about how they were connected to the supernatural realm. So they did not need to have a book that shared that story with them, because they could just look at something and it was right there. So thank you very much. If you've got questions or comments, I welcome them. So, yes?
Sorry, just a quick question
Yeah.
on this teepee that was your family's. What kind of story was that?
So I don't have a picture. Oh, okay. So the question was, what is the story behind this particular teepee? It's in my book. No. No, I'm joking. Yeah, spoiler alert. So, so this particular teepee is called the Big Rock teepee, and you can't tell from this picture, but there's a rock on both sides of the teepee, in the front and in the back. And most teepees, so there's a standard design for most teepees in Blackfeet society. So most teepees have, on the bottom, have this motif that you can see here, which is a motif that shows the mountains off into the distance. And then it shows these circles, and what the circles are fallen stars. And there's a lot of star stories and star myths that talk about the various stars on teepees. Usually on the top of a teepee, this one doesn't have it. Usually on the, so the bottom of the teepee represents the earth. The top of the teepee represents the sky world. And it has 2 different constellations and a star normally that are painted on the top of a teepee. The bottom of the teepee is painted red. The top of the teepee is painted black because those are representing the earth. Those are representing the sky. There's a long story about this rock, and that has to do with a supernatural entity that lives in a rock house. And it's a long story. I'm trying to think of it. What is the story? It's about a supernatural entity that lives in a rock house that kidnaps a bunch of children, and then there's a long story about how the children get returned back to the community. So there are actually a lot of stories about kind of there's the moral of the story ends up being things like, you know, how you treat people, how you be generous, kindness, being a good parent, being a good community member, being a good family member. So some of those stories that you end up with a moral to the story. The moral to the story that the children get returned to the community, and that one of the things that community family do is take care of each other. That was the quick version of that story. But yeah, so that was painted on there. There's 2 I'm gonna have you stand up and help me. So wait, there's 2 folks back here, so maybe right here first.
I'm curious to know the language that you interviewed your grandmama in, and then also being so scholarly, myself having been in university for too many years, I find often that blurs my connection with religion and the natural world, and so I'm wondering if you have not practiced some of the indigenous rites and rituals of your own people.
So that's 2 different questions. So one was, what language did I interview my grandmother in? And the second was about practicing religion myself. So first, the answer to the first question is, I interviewed my grandmother primarily in English. She has been interviewed in Blackfeet, though, as well. One of the things I had her do, though, was when there were times where it was easier for her to answer me in Blackfeet, I had her answer, because sometimes it's easy. Sometimes things just can't be translated, like words can't be translated or concepts can't be translated, so it's easier just to say it in the original language. But in terms of me asking the questions, that was not a problem in English. The second part of the story, in terms of practicing religion, so that's a complicated question, but I actually decided intentionally not to practice Blackfeet religion because I wanted to write about it. And I just thought it would be unethical for me to practice a religion and write about the religion at the same time, because when you're practicing a religion, there are oftentimes things within that religion that are only only people in that religion are allowed to experience. And so I decided to do it sort of from outside of the church than inside of the church. And there's two different ways to write about religion. You guys probably all know that. You can write from inside of the church, and that's one type of historical analysis. And you can also write from outside. And I decided that I just thought it was unethical for me to write from inside the church. So that's a good question, though. I'm back there.
When you were writing earlier about the predominant story that American Indian peoples, indigenous peoples, were subject to nature or part of nature rather than controlling nature, I was wondering how you might think that fit with the Western European idea of manifest destiny, that if something part of nature is more like a resource and can be controlled, if it has no volition of its own. And I wonder what you think about that.
Ooh, that's a good question. Let me think about how to rephrase that. So your question is, so the Western idea of the natural world is that it's a resource that can be used kind of for humans. And how does that fit with kind of the Blackfeet idea of the natural world?
Or I wonder if that story saying that the Blackfeet and other indigenous peoples were part of nature, if that enabled Western Europeans to subject indigenous peoples and simply practice some genocide on them because they were part of the natural world and weren't in control of their own destinies. I don't know, maybe that's a wild idea.
Now I don't know. Now I'm not sure what your question was at that now. So yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not quite sure if I'm understanding what it is.
In Western European history of Western expansion, it's sometimes as if indigenous peoples were invisible, not really there. I mean, they are there, but they're not really there. And I wondered if thinking that they're part of the natural world, therefore part of what could be controlled, rather than another sentient being that is in control of their own destiny. That idea of them being part of nature tells some of the massacres and other things that happen.
From the Western point of view.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. Got it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No. So quick, just to let everyone know, it is 10 till. So for those of you who need to run off to another class, I was asked to let everyone know when it's 10 till.
If any of my students have not signed their roll,
Come on down. So there's a long answer to that question. So the impact of disease is something that I still think has been understudied. Depending on what scholars you read, somewhere around, the highest level is like 90% of indigenous people died from disease even before there was contact. You can look historically at places and look at the waves of disease that went through. So disease that happened before contact, disease that happened with contact, disease that happened after contact, the diseases that continued to happen well into the 20th century. So disease has had a huge impact on indigenous communities. And that, more than anything else, has been one of the drivers for Western expansion and has been one of the drivers for American colonization and expansion. And so that's something that we sort of is often not talked about enough. So that happened first. So when you said that, that when kind of Western expansion happens and the West or Americans don't view Indians or see them, are viewing them or seeing this invisible, I can't even say the word, as they're invisible, I would argue In some cases, that's probably correct because people were no longer there because of disease. So that's just a kind of a huge impact. Western expansion didn't happen without disease. If disease had not happened, we would have a totally different story here in North America, completely different, because that was one of the driving forces. So anyway, hopefully that sort of answers your question. Yeah. Other thoughts or comments? They don't need to be a question. Comments, questions? Yes.
I have a question. How does this differ from some of the other Algonquin peoples on the Northern Plains and their views of the natural, or of this, invisible world and of the natural visible world?
I think it's very common. I think, so the question is how is this the same or different with other groups? I think it's very common that a lot of indigenous groups believe that there was a multiple realms of existence. Different tribes had different ideas. One of the things I didn't talk about, only because I didn't have enough time here, is that, the Blackfeet believed there were 3 separate realms of existence. And in each one of those realms of existence were plants, animals, beings, people, monsters, etc. And there were also humans. And humans could live in any of those 3 realms of existence. Humans primarily lived here on Earth, but they could live in the sky world. They could live in the water world. I think that is similar to other religious practices. If we take a look at like Christianity, for example, Christianity believes there's 3 realms of existence, right? We believe that there's earth, there's heaven, and there's hell. Those are 3 different realms of existence. People, humans, can go between those 3 realms of existence. Humans have gone to heaven, right? And they're living there now. If you're a Christian, you believe that. Humans have gone to hell. People who live in heaven are certain beings, and there's lots of different stories about the people who live there. And it's a different reality. People who live in hell also have a different reality. So anyway, so different religious belief systems also have this idea of there being a visible physical realm that we live in and an invisible realm that we live in. That's why, so the first religious community that came to the Blackfeet were the Catholics and mostly the Jesuit, which is a specific order of Catholicism. And so when they came, the very first thing they did was they learned the language, they learned the religious practice, they tried to understand. The Jesuits were very good at trying to understand people from where they were. So learning their language, understanding their religion was important as a method to kind of open that door and get into that culture and community. And so that's why people like Father Legal had, one of the things he left behind was this very long manuscript that he wrote about Blackfeet religion. And the reason he wrote it was not because he was recording a story about Blackfeet religion. He was writing it so that he could share it with other people and say, this is what these people think and believe about the world. And if we, the Jesuits, are going to come and convert them to Catholicism, we need to know what is their frame of reference and how are they thinking about the world that they live in. And now that we do, now we can, here's what we need to do. And they also, of course, learned the language. So, yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question. So I'm the Navajo from the Navajo Reservation, and I myself have seen and done have a minor in Native American Studies, and I've seen a lot of different religions on the Navajo Reservation. One being traditional, another being NAC, Native American Church, and then also Catholic, Baptist, LDS. So different types of religions. And a lot of when colonization occurred or exposure, assimilation was exposed with religion. And so that being said now, I kind of sometimes ponder myself
Right, right. No, that's a really good question. And, we have something similar on the Blackfeet Reservation. I would argue that on our reservation now, the majority so most people are religious, right? There is a small number of people, and they're usually younger people who are atheist and consider themselves atheists. The largest religious practice on our reservation is Catholicism. The second largest is probably Pentecostalism. And then after that is Blackfeet Religion, right? And then atheism. So, those kind of the four major. So there are still people who practice, but I think, personally, the key to anybody's culture, history, or in their community is language. And I think language comes first. And so I think if communities can maintain their indigenous languages, that is the first step to those communities being able to maintain their stories and maintain their religious practice, maintain their prayers, maintain their cultural worldview. I think you can, though, also kind of related to your question, I think you can still learn the worldview of a people without practicing the religion of that people. So, I know very intimately, mostly from stories from my grandparents, but also doing historical research, what is the worldview? And by that I mean kind of the religious structure, the framework of Blackfeet. I also know it for Christianity, right? I also know it for several other religions. I think you can understand those frameworks and those structures of multiple religions without practicing that religion. Yeah, so, yeah.
Just am wondering if you ever find it a barrier when non-natives put our religion into the mystical arena, and therefore it may discredit the truth and logic behind our religions. And are you sometimes bothered by that?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think one of the things, so the question was about, do sometimes outsiders, non-native people kind of make native religion seem so like mystical, and I think that one of the things that happens is that not only non-native, non-whatever the tribe, non-indigenous, often just simplify it, right? It gets so simplified that people don't see the complexity, and most indigenous religions are very complex, and Navajo is one, definitely very complex creation story, really complex, like all of the different beings that exist. It's a very complex story. And what ends up happening is that gets then simplified to something where it's almost unrecognizable to people who are from that community. And what happens, and we know this in indigenous communities, is often our stories get turned into children's stories, right? So instead of a story being a story of something, a being or something happening, it gets turned into a children's book, right? And then you look at the children and you go, oh my God, like that's not even what kind of about the story, but not really. But so a lot of our stuff, and that's been happening for the last 100 years, right? Our stories are turned into children's stories. When it gets that simplified, it really erases kind of the depth, the complexity of that community and those people. So adding on to your mystical, I think that the other issue is just kind of the simplification. Simplification almost to the point of erasure is what happens with indigenous religions. Yeah.
Just to piggyback off that, are there other words? Is there a need for a language change? I know you've used the word supernatural. I'm wondering, is there a different word that can replace that so that we're not edging into that area?
Yeah. So I did that intentionally. So are there any religious studies scholars out here? None. Okay. Religious studies scholars hate the word supernatural, right? They like to use other words as well. So I use that word intentionally because people know what that means when you say it, right? So if I say things like, it happened in the divine, most people don't know what the divine means, right? That's kind of a religious studies word. There's other words when people talk. There's anthropological words, other than human people, other than human places, right? I don't like other than human whatever. That's the kind of terminology that gets used. So I used it intentionally only because if you were to ask 90% of people and you say, what does natural mean? What does supernatural mean? Almost everybody's going to give the same definition, whereas if you use other types of language and words, people will give you different definitions. So yeah, no, I did it intentionally, actually, because of that. And I do mention kind of in my preface that I did that intentionally and that I was avoiding the anthropological ways of describing this and the religious studies ways of describing this. But there are definitely more academic, scholarly ways to talk about these things. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm curious to know, where does a scholar begin putting a beginning to a community? Most of my studies have been the Mississippian culture. We've got a lot of archaeology. Without any history, or you're just guessing at the mounds and the finds. So particularly with the Blackfeet, where's the beginning and how do you find it?
That's a great question. So I use many sources. So one, I like reading about the archaeology to see. So of course, okay, what did the Blackfeet think first? The Blackfeet think we've always been where we are since the beginning of time. Why? Because our stories tell us that, right? So one is to take Indigenous people at their word, right? So when I write about the Blackfeet, I say, this is what the Blackfeet think. Okay, well, but then here's what the archaeologists think, right? And here's what the anthropologists think, and here's what historians think. So everybody thinks something different. I love reading archaeology just to know what people are doing. Archaeology, as most people know who study it, it is kind of guesswork, but educated guesswork to figure out what people are up to, how long people have been in a place. We're still learning that. People are doing now DNA testing, right? There's all this great DNA testing work out. And there was an example recently out in the Northwest Coast where there was a human remain that was found. They did DNA testing and they found out that it was thousands of years old, and it was from the same people who were living right there, right? So the people who said, we've been here for thousands of years, we've always been here, the DNA evidence showed that that was correct, right? All of this is kind of interesting, kind of new science, new academic work, et cetera. But I usually start with what do the people say themselves and start there, yeah. But that's a great question. So quick, how much time do we have? So
Maybe one more question?
I think we're good.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes,
LaPier.
thank you.